We are on now the last example or examples of section 4.4 day 1, but this is the one that I would say is the most important of the entire day. This is putting it all together, trying to graph sines and cosines by hand. And I've got some really important tips for you in this one that I think will come in very handy as you're graphing all kinds of different things here. Now, one thing that you need to know about these sorts of graphs is that a lot of them might look the same but just have different labels. And so one thing that is super important that we're doing whenever we're graphing sines and cosines is we need to be really specific about how we're labeling things. We need to include those labels. Let's start on each one of these with filling in this information you see over here. The zeros are going to be more of an afterthought. We'll do that later. But start with 2 sine 2x. First of all, amplitude, that comes from this one, means that the amplitude is going to be 2. That's how far away it is from the center of the graph up to the top of wherever we're going. Period. Now, period is normally 2 pi, but remember from last example, we're going to divide b, so whatever this is. So in this case, we're going to have 2 pi divided by 2, which is going to make our period pi for this problem. Now the min and the max, those just have to do with the amplitude. So if the amplitude's 2, that means the max is 2, the minimum is -2. All right, very similar thing down here as we fill in some stuff. We've got -4 cosine x divided by 3. The -4, we're not going to deal with that yet. That has to do with a transformation, but the amplitude is just simply +4. The period, we're going to be using this 3, but this is really 1/3 x. So our period in this case is going to be 2 pi divided by 1/3, which that will simplify to 6 pi. So be a little careful about that when you divide. It's, really, when you divide by a fraction, it's multiplying by the reciprocal. All right, min and max. Max is 4, min is -4. Okay, now we'll be going on to the actual graph itself. Here's probably the most important thing about graphing these by hand is noticing what the period is. So for sine and cosine, whatever that period is, what I want you to do is make a grid where both sides are of equal length. I'm going to go right to the very end and I'm going to call that pi. Whatever that period is, I'm going to call it pi. Or excuse me, whatever that period is, that's what I'm going to put at the end. Then I'm going to separate this line up into 4 equal chunks. Really important that you do it in 4 equal chunks. And I'm going to start cutting it in half. Halfway to pi is pi over 2. And then, of course, halfway in between 0 and pi over 2, that's pi over 4. This one's 3 pi over 4. So you can, as long as you have a couple of the labels, you're going to be okay in this case. But I want you to be really clear about the labels. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Divide it into 4 equal chunks. We got -pi over here. We've got -pi over 2. And that's enough to label the horizontal axis. Now, in this case, the amplitude is 2, so I'm going to be going 2 above and 2 below. I'm just going to make sure I've got enough room. I'll put those 2 tick marks to indicate that I'm going 2 above and below. All right, down here, I'm going to set up this grid too before we graph anything, but 6 pi is the period. So again, I'm going to go to the very end and I'm just going to write what the period is, 6 pi. And I'm going to divide it into 4 equal chunks. Now that it gets a little trickier sometimes when you're working with different numbers here, but then I'm -6 pi on this side. Divide this into 4 equal chunks. Well, what do each of those chunks equal? We can start dividing it in half. If I go half of 6 pi, that is 3 pi. And I can do -3 pi over here. Now half of 3 pi is 3 pi over 2, so it's basically 1.5 pi for each one of these tick marks. But we don't really need to have that written in there. As long as we got a couple of the labels, we're okay. On this one, since the amplitude is 4, I'm going to use the same amount of space, but I'm just going to put 4 tick marks and just have them be a little bit closer together. So it's kind of cheating that we can do those labels in that different way, but at the same time, it's really not, as long as we're being really accurate about where we're putting everything. All right, now for actually graphing these. So when we graph sine and cosine, we want to remember that cosine and sine, they start at different spots. Sine, we're going to do that first because that's the simplest one. That starts at 0, 0. Now, the basic shape is that it goes up as we go to the right, and then it goes back down. It'll come back, and what should happen is that it should be back home at pi. That's where the period ends. So we're going to start by going up, and that first tick over, we're going to go all the way up to the maximum. Then the next tick over is going to go back down to 0, and we just keep rotating between those important points. The next tick over goes down to the minimum, and then we're back to home base. And so what we've got for this right-hand side is something like that. Now we are also going to, it'll often say graph 2 full periods on these, and so I'm going to just go to the other side and repeat the pattern, just making sure I'm going in the correct direction, and I go back and forth on those. So we've got down, then up, and then up, and down. And so that's going to be my first graph here. I've got an amplitude of 2, and I've got a period of pi, so it looks like that. All right, that's the first one. The second one here is a cosine graph, and what I mentioned before is that we usually start at 0, 1, but don't get too hung up on the 1. It basically just means 0 max. And so normally if we've got the 4 out in front, if we didn't have the negative, we'd be starting at 0, 4. Well, since it's negative, that actually just flips it. We do a reflection over here, and we start down there at the minimum instead. Now the only way to go is up, so the next tick is going to be at 0. Then the next one over, only place to go is up, and then we're going to go back down, and then back to square one. So we are, again, putting in the important points and then connecting the dots with a smooth curve at the end. We're going to repeat the pattern over on this side, but each tick mark that you go over, that's why we're dividing it into 4 pieces. We go from minimum to 0, and then we go from 0 to maximum, maximum to 0, and 0 back down to minimum. And so we have to follow those patterns. And again, please try to make it a smooth curve. One of the things I see a lot of people do in sine and cosine graphs is make them all sharp curves. That's not something that happens here. These are smooth, they are waves, and so we should make them smooth. Now, one other comment that I'll make, we didn't talk about the zeros yet. The zeros here, what we can do is we can list them all out, but notice that they're going to go on forever after that. And so while we have negative pi, we have pi over 2, we've got 0, we've got pi over 2, and we've got pi, but then it goes on forever in both directions, so you can do a dot, dot, dot to indicate that it keeps going on. In this case, we have the ones that are in between here. These are a little harder to identify, but we'll give it our best here. These ones, so halfway between 3 pi and 0 is 3 pi over 2. So that's going to be one of our zeros. And then we also have negative 3 pi over 2. Now if we go another pi and a half, so like this is essentially 4.5 pi. This one, if we go 1.5 pi, 3 pi, 4.5 pi, 6 pi. So that's 4.5 pi, which is the same fraction as 9 pi over 2. But each time we're really just, adding 3 pi to each one. And then we can go the dot, 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 and then over here we can do negative 9 pi over 2 and dot, dot, dot this way to indicate that there are an infinite number of those, but we're not going to deal with all of them. The very last thing I'll say about this problem is that you'll notice it says an interval of negative 2 pi to 2 pi. Some of your problems in your assignment will do that, but I want you to ignore those directions. Here's what I want you to be graphing instead. I want you to be graphing 2 full periods. That is the goal in any of these problems, is that we're going to be graphing 2 full periods. So as you'll notice, I did 1 period on this side, 1 period on this side, but it went from negative 6 pi to positive 6 pi. So I didn't follow this one. I just did 2 full periods. If you only did negative 2 pi to 2 pi, you would only have a short little section of this graph, and it wouldn't be complete. So I want you to do 2 full periods. This is a lot of stuff all in one. Hopefully you made it through the video. Please let me know if you have questions. As I mentioned, this graphing stuff is the most important thing. This is the most important slide from 4.4, day 1 or day 2. So hopefully you get this. This kind of thing will be on the test.